Hello, the internet, and welcome back to another episode of the Ideas About God podcast. I am your host. I'm Josh Wise.
And
Hello.
I am Fabian. I am the other host. Ideas About God is a place where we talk about life, pop culture, theology, all with the hope of making ideas about God interesting, applicable, helpful, whatever it may be for your life.
Yeah.
And if you would please hit the plus button on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on Spotify, leave us reviews, share this with your friends.
Yes.
You can find us on Instagram at Ideas About God. Follow us there. We post some clips, some teasers for episodes so you know when they're coming out.
Yes.
So yeah, that's all we got. This episode, we're continuing our process party.
Yes.
Talking about process theology, a
Yes.
reframing of maybe our understanding of God or the things that we've learned. And we're going to be talking about, so what is God? If God isn't necessarily all-powerful in the ways that we've traditionally understood God, or all-knowing in the ways that we've traditionally understood all-knowing to be, what is God? So
that question, we've already kind of talked about what a classical theist would say God is, right?
Yeah.
It's like with those omni words, like omnipotent, all-knowing, all loving, right? All these big words that we just talk about God as like this, like complete, like unchanging kind of character. And we talked about how a lot of that actually comes more from like classical like Greek philosophy than it does like, from like the text itself. However, like, that's how it goes. Like we mix that stuff into our philosophy and we kind of move on and it works and then it stops working. Like I know like those classical theistic ideas, I know for me, like they stop working in like very personal ways and maybe and for you as well. And also like for more like philosophical reasons, like you kind of see like they kind of like seem like they don't work as well.
and like this thread has existed theologically for a while, but the questions became bigger for some people, like around World War I and World War II, where they're sitting there going, okay, if God is all powerful, why isn't God stopping how ugly this is? And so and so that's kind of how some of the questions maybe in the broader conversations, but in our own personal lives, there's been those moments too where we're like, wait a minute, like if God is all powerful, then why is God doing this for this person and not this for this person? Why isn't God ending some of the horrible, horrific things that are happening in the world? And
so that's kind of some of the problems we have with classical theism. And then here we go. There's the process party, right? And so process philosophy is pulling from a bunch of different strains, and we've talked about some of that. We've talked about ontology. So process philosophy asserts. Man, we're talking as hard today. Process philosophy asserts that the universe is not made up of things like substance ontology, right? It's not made out of like yes, the atoms are real, but what we're saying is that underneath it all, the universe is really a long series of events. You are an event. This table is an event. It is a collection of atoms that came together and they form this table, and then at a certain point, they're all going to kind of go away.
Yeah.
And that's this constant process. The world is constantly in this in the process of becoming as things pass into and go out of being, and that we're part of that. And so that's kind of like what the ontology, what's the world is made out of for a process philosopher. So okay, now what do we talk about when we talk about God? What is God? And the kind of two terms that are used to describe God in the process world are open and relational. And I think we can start with the relational? We'll go there first?
Yeah, let's go relational.
Okay, so relational and open then.
Yeah.
So relational is this idea that God is in relation to all things. Now, there's this idea in like classical theism, they would say like, oh, well, God is omnipresent, right? God is everywhere.
Yeah.
And a process philosopher or a process theologian would take this idea and they're just like crank it up to 11. And they're like, not only is God present, but God is present on a very intimate level. God is experiencing what you're experiencing with you.
Yeah.
God, when you experience things, whether that is, falling in love or eating a good meal or mowing the lawn, whatever that might be, right? God is also in that experience with you. So this has all sort of really like powerful ideas because it means we're not alone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like God is this ever present companion beside you. There's that story from the Holocaust about like the man who's like was watching someone be killed. Right. It was a child being executed, and someone was like, "Where's God?" And he's like, "He's up there." Right. Like it's in one way, like it's very existential, but also it's also like kind of speaks to like, no, God is also in this moment with us and experiencing this horror like with us.
Yeah.
And that to me I find really cool.
Yeah.
And I also think that opens up all sorts of interesting ideas where you look like you want to jump in.
What I was going to say, just like going back to the ontology thing, one of the things that we talked about is that there's things are in relationship with each other, right? Like, and we describe ourselves in relation in the relationships that we have, right? So our relationships to our job and the way that we, do things in the world and what we care about and the impact that we want to make. Our relationship to friends, family, spouses, children, our pets. And so, I guess there's all these relationships that exist in the world. So like at the atomic level, you have electrons, protons, neutrons are in relationship with each other. And then, kind of expand that a little bit. We get up to, the cell level, there's relationships at the cell level. And then those cells, come together to make organisms eventually. If you go up the hierarchy, and organisms are in relationship to each other, we have a relationship with the trees that are outside. We have a relationship with each other. We have a relationship with this table. And so there's all these sorts of relationships that are already existing. And so what you're saying, or I'm hearing you say, is that God is somehow in those relationships.
Yes.
And all of those relationships, there's something about God in them.
Yes. And probably how you would describe whether that God is that relationship itself or God is in the relationship as like a third party or something like that. That probably is going to depend on what theologian you would ask. But I think all of them would point to and hold very dear this idea that God is in relationship to all things. And so, so that's God is like this open relational thing. The second part, so we have open relational. So that's the relational part. Okay, let's go into the open bit. Open is primarily referring to God's understanding of the future. So, and this also has, I guess, I have a subheading of another really important part of process or open relational philosophy is one, that God does not exert force over anything, right? So there's this idea that we have in classical theism that God can come into the universe and do something, right? Like whether we call that a miracle, in like the classical sense, or whether like God can come in and like change a person's heart, right? There is God, here's a universe and here's God. And sometimes God comes in and breaks the universe to achieve an end that God wants, right? And that's another challenging issue with like classical theism. It's like, okay, why is God intervening here and not here? Also, we have a God just like breaking rules in the universe, like breaking physics or something like that. That doesn't seem to map out to how we understand the universe to be, because like we don't really have miracles in a technical sense. Like most miracles we can find to be explained. So like I don't know, like so it doesn't, like classical theism is like kind of holds God and the universe like separate and says like God it imposes God's will on the world, and
arbitrarily,
too,
or we just sometimes what people will say is, well, we're just going to leave that up to mystery. So like God broke physics for this cancer patient, but God didn't break physics or biology for this cancer patient. We don't know why. God just did. Whatever God does. And
that's a hard answer for a lot of folks to swallow, right? Like I don't want to. And so that's when so we have a God, and said process philosophers like, well, God can't, right? God can't, because that's not what God is capable of doing. And there's also how you actually like say that is different. My biggest thing is when like someone comes to me and they're like, well, what do you mean God can't? That means like they're really uncomfortable with this idea that God can't do something. And I'm like, well, there's already all sorts of logical things that God can't do. God can't make 2 + 2 = 5, right? Can God do that? Can God break the laws of logic? Can God create a stone so big God can't lift it, right? Like, so very quickly, like, you're like, oh, like omnipotence at like a logical level doesn't really make sense, right? And then also, we have like this all powerful in a God's character sense, also I think we run into issues because you're like, well, can God do something that's unloving?
Yeah.
And so, because if you hold to the fact, and this is depending on the form of Christian, you can God like act in an unloving way?
Mm-hmm.
And they would say no. However, we would just define what unloving is, right? They would say like, oh, like that thing was loving, even though we can't see it. They would still hold it as loving. And I'm like, but so you're saying God, all of his actions, whether we agree them being or not, God cannot act outside of God's character.
Yeah.
Right. God cannot be uncharacteristically evil or something like God wakes up and is like, oh, I'm going to be bad today. Like that God can't do that. So you also don't agree that God is all powerful.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
and then the only answer you have in that is you either say, well, God does things arbitrarily, we don't know the answer, or you create an equally powerful being that is evil to create that separation between, the good and the evil.
Yeah.
And so then you have all kinds of problems of like, well, if there's a being that's, whatever, quote unquote Satan, that's equal to God's power, well, like, did God create that being? And then why did God create that being? So what's interesting, though, as you were talking about the transition from relational to open and this idea that, maybe the future isn't determined, that in some ways God is actively present with us through relationships.
Yes.
And in a loving way, leading the future forward, active in those relationships. It's almost like those two things are intrinsically connected. So the future is open because God doesn't, because that would be sort of rob us of our agency and our ability to have free will and make choices if God just had already determined what's going to happen in the future.
Right. That's so there's that question of like in theology, churchy language, right? We call it like eschatology, right?
Yeah.
Like what is the end, right?
Yeah.
And so for classical theism, the end is God is going to come in and then, depending on what flavor Christianity come from, you might have like charts and like you've mapped out revelations like some lunatic. But you at some point you have this idea that God is going to make things right. God is going to come in and impose God's will.
Yeah.
Or we have, there's also like, Christians imposing God's will depending on like what flavor of like Christianity come from. But either way, it's this idea that God is going to somehow force the world into perfection, right?
Mm-hmm.
God is going to get what God wants, and it's going to, at some level, going to have to impose his will on something.
Yeah.
Whereas the open relational theology, this is like the heavy open part, is that like God has like intentions for the universe, right? God has, to get like God has a plan for your life, right? Not like that. Well, maybe, but like this idea that there are things that God wants, and we can like have discussions about what those are. Some of the things that come to mind for me are like I believe that God wants beauty, God wants love, God wants diversity, God wants like
justice,
flourishing. And life seems to be like, as we look at, because that's I can't like argue for anything other than sort of like these are just things I believe and also things that like I feel like, but I'm like, if you're like holding a gun to my head, I'm like I really don't know, like, but the honest thing is like so in order for God to achieve those ends, right, a process philosopher is like, well, God is not imposing flourishing onto the universe. Instead, God is in every present moment, in every relationship, with everything from all the people and down to atoms to everything, inviting them into like God's desire, right? God is inviting them into flourishing. God is inviting them into fuller life. And
then that's where evil comes in. So instead of defining evil as this other being that's equally powerful because you can't reconcile the fact that evil things would happen if God is all powerful. So you have to create this other being. Instead, you say, well, evil is when human beings, whether individually or collectively, make choices to go against the invitation of this loving God that is in relationship with us.
Yeah.
So actively, whether consciously or subconsciously, maybe there's like something happening within us, we experienced trauma in our past or whatever, that in some way or another we are making choices that are going against that invitation of the loving God. And
Yeah.
so we can define evil that way rather than having to have a being that's whatever, what's the language we use that is tempting people.
Yes.
Like, you know.
Right. Yeah. And I think what that does is, and this is kind of like, I mean, to me, there are a lot of benefits from looking at the world through a process lens, right? There are a lot, like, if it hadn't been for process philosophy, I probably would have been like, no, I'm out of this whole Christian thing. Like, if it hadn't been for this, like, discovering these ideas, I'd been out. But a lot of the benefits is one, it allows me to redefine, and this is really something we're planning on talking about today, but it allows me to redefine like sin.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because, growing up, Christianity was like, well, sin is anytime you go against God's law, right? God has, moral mandates that you must do, and you're gonna fail most of them, and then that's what sin is, right? And sin is like this moral code that kind of exists outside the universe. Whereas, like, in a process perspective, like, I still like. I know there's also in like liberal Christianity like not be comfortable with the word sin, right?
Yeah.
And I agree that word has been used to like a lot of pain and a lot of people. As word has hurt a lot of folks. And so like if people aren't comfortable using it, I understand. But for me, it's like a better word to talk about it is like health, right? Like what is healthy for me in this moment? Like, is it to go and eat an entire box of, Captain Crunch? And I'll be like, well, yeah, it's going to taste good, but also my roof of my mouth's going to be wrecked, and I'm not going to feel good.
Because if you don't let it get soft enough, Captain Crunch, like, man, it just wrecks you. It just cuts up your mouth. Especially the yellow ones, the square ones.
and so kind of like, there's a sense of like, I'm not like, sin is no longer this kind of like moral thing that exists outside of me. It is now like this thing of like, I am every moment and am capable of, am I going to make a life affirming choice here? Or am I going to do something that's not? And also it allows me to like, just be honest. Cause sometimes I don't know. Yeah. Right. Sometimes like you can be in a situation and be like, man, I don't know what the best choice is for myself. Right. And it allows you to be like, I'm just doing my best. And sometimes you just gotta, you don't know, and maybe we look back later and you're like, oh man, that wasn't a different choice, and like that. So this whole sin thing like gets radically redefined from this external thing, but also to like something that allows you to be much more like human, and allows you to be much more like like you're just doing your best with what you have, and allows you to give yourself some grace. I don't know that we didn't plan on talking about sin at all, but like
no, that's helpful. But no, it sounds like it's so. What I hear you saying is that it's meaningful for you, and I think there's something big that you said, and I'm curious about, and I think this will be helpful for people listening to kind of take it down to just our own personal level. Like, what's the why behind this journey that we've gone on to like examine and, sort of deconstruct and, find a different way or read other people and what's been compelling about these process theologians for us. For you, there's something about, you said, I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't find this version of God. Yeah. Talk more about that.
So, like, and even now, looking at, like, what Christian has come to mean in the last, I don't know, like 8 years or so, there are times where I'm like, well, maybe I don't need that label. But, like, the thing that has kept me around Christianity, I think has, like, or at least, like, faith is like I couldn't do the God that I grew up with any longer, right? That was a no-go. And so, part of reconstructing, I knew like, why do people suffer who don't need to suffer? Like why the problem of evil, right? Like, why is that? And then I need a God who also is like present to the actual suffering in the world, right? I think too often we have a God who is abstracted from the universe, right? Like it gets to a point where, like it's almost like it's like being in a relationship, right? Like if you're in a relationship and if you can get along without your partner, I'm not saying like you should be codependent, like codependent, but like if you can get along life just fine without your partner, then like why are you? Yeah. What's the point, right? So like if we have a God, we can have a universe that is like more and more explained without God, then what even is God? We're just abstracting out to like a thing that's like not even a thing, right? Yeah. Like we're into like some sort of like deism or God who just like kickstarted the universe and then just like sat back and didn't do anything. Yeah. However, and then in opposition to that, you have like the fundamentalist response where like we're like, no, like, you know, like hardcore, like we need to like bring God, like go, no, God is thing, even if that means like we have to ignore, you know, what science says, right? And that's like the fundamental spec.
And even be confrontational to it. Yeah.
And that's not
because it's anti, you know, I mean, and we see what's happening right now with, you know, Christian nationalism and stuff like that. Well, we've touched upon a little bit in past episodes, but you almost have this sense that you have to be confrontational to it. And part of it is because then you, like, if you have this being called Satan, then you label everything that's happening that doesn't fit your worldview under that worldview, and so you have to be against it. And it's I guess I kind of lost track of thought, but sorry,
no, it's not fine. It's I guess this idea is that a process philosophy gave me like the tools needed to think about God, find God again in a way that was healthy and constructing, a way where God is not like this, the security blanket doesn't function as like, you know, like, oh, I'm here to like, because life is really scary sometimes, right? And it kind of this God who functions as like a security blanket is just going to keep me safe from all the boogeymen, right? Instead, I have found a God who like instead experiences the world with me, who is afraid when I am afraid, who like when I am worried about like the future, this God is like, right? Like sits with me in that, right? And isn't in a way of like, oh, don't worry, buddy, everything's going to be okay. But a God who's like, you know, cool, like here's like, I don't know, supernatural hug or something like that, right? Like instead I have found a God who like experiences those things with me, like, and that to me is like what makes God great about process philosophy is that it means that like life really matters. So like let's say like you make a 1 in a million half court shot, right?
Yeah.
And you're terrible at basketball.
Yeah.
That is exciting for you.
Yeah.
You lose your goddamn mind. You're like flipping out. Hell yeah. You knew the odds were like next to nil of you making that, right? God also knew those were 1 in a million odds, right? God also knew I was like, I don't know, like he doesn't play basketball, like this guy, like he's trash, right? But so God is experiencing novelty with you, right? Like that's the cool thing about process philosophy is that it's like all new attributes can then be assigned to God instead of God being this cosmic force that exists outside of time because he sees all of it. God is now in time with us, and like we now have like. Maybe God likes adventure. Yeah. Maybe God likes zest, right? Maybe God likes, you know, a life that's flourishing, a God who responds to novelty, a God who likes the new, right? Yeah. And to me, that's I think that we have. Yeah, to me that's what I find beautiful and compelling about process philosophy is like, oh, like it's instead of God existing outside, like God is like in the midst, like you know, like a forest or something like that, right? Like just like vibrant and alive.
Like God isn't apathetic.
Yeah.
God is, you know, God isn't this like abstract thing away, separated, but God is present, intimately present. Yeah. And you know, that was a big thing for me too, is and I think that's actually, now that I think about it, it's interestingly that shift happened before I really understood open and relational theology. Yeah. The shift where people that I was around were using the language of, you know, God doesn't create suffering, but God is with us in the suffering. Yeah. Which I always found so beautiful because I was like, oh my gosh, that is so helpful. And coming from an atheist perspective where like I had nothing to do, like besides just be angry personally. You know, for other people, they may have found something helpful, but for me personally, that worldview where there was no God at all, and it's just these static events, I didn't know what to do with suffering. Besides just be so mad that it happens. Yeah. And then when I, you know, sort of kind of came into the world of faith and heard this language of a God that experiences with, it's just beautiful because the hardest thing about suffering, yes, it's the suffering, it's also being alone in it. It's is there somebody that cares? Yeah. And if you have this infinite being that is, you know, omnipresent in the world, in relationships, and is inviting and is with us and is moved by things happening, like that's beautiful. You know, that was really meaningful for me. And then when you think about Christianity, and I think this is where, you know, the connection for me, it's the tradition I grew up in, and so it's what's around and all of that. There's something to the fact that, you know, in Christianity we talk about Jesus being God, this God taking on flesh and becoming human and experiencing and being moved by the death of a friend, and the grieving that's happening around him. This God that like ate with people and was like tangibly walking around and like living life with people.
Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful representation of the open and relational God that is present.
Right.
But with, when we move to like, just, I guess if you want to use the language of the Trinity, then we kind of expand it. We say, well, Jesus was God doing it in a particular moment in time and history.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have now this, kind of the bigger, I guess, Richard Rohr uses the language of the cosmic Christ, kind of this like God is present. And it also, if you get really spicy with it, you can say things like, well, when somebody is moved by their own faith tradition, they're experiencing this similar open and relational God. Now, we've had conversations about, should we impose and say there's one God? That's a whole tricky thing. Yeah. But what that allows me personally to do is be curious about somebody else's
there you go.
experiences of God and their faith tradition, rather than be in opposition to it. Yeah. Because I have this abstracted God that fits into a box.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, process makes pluralism way more interesting.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh man, it's so good. I want to go back to something you said, and because I think your experience, you talked about how you resonated with some of these like process ideas before you actually understood process. And I think a lot of people do, right? A lot of people hear that stuff and they're like, oh man, that feels right. Yeah. Like if they were to talk about God, they talk about God in process terms. Yeah. However, when they go, like they don't, when they go to, like maybe they go to like their pastor or something like that, and they actually like, like learn and talk about actual God, people are like, well, yeah, God is just, it's like more metaphorical, right? They're like, oh, we didn't really mean that. Yeah. When like it's like we're like, yes, like God experiences it, but God's like actually, well, God's like unmovable, right? Yeah. Like God's like, so we have like this thing. It's like, but people don't find that to be true in their own personal experience, and I think like what process does is like, oh no, like you can have that, right? Like it's like when we say God is present to all suffering and God is to be found everywhere, like process philosophers can like wholly behind that and full-throatedly say yes, like we can, right? Yeah. Whereas like someone who's more like maybe Calvinist would be like, no, like someone who's like more like classical theistic idea, like they would be like, no, like there are things that God's not in, or maybe there would be like God like planned this, God didn't like suffer with you, but God like planned it, but God suffered it. So now it's like way more complicated and weird. However, like you in process philosophy, you're like, no, God also thinks this is a tragedy that you had to go through this horrific thing. Yeah. And God is suffering with it alongside you. Right. Yeah. So when we say God is moved by your own pain, like process philosophers like, yes, that's not like metaphorical. God's experience, just like when you feel pain, you change and grow and become more compassionate. Yeah. Maybe God is doing same. Like maybe God is experiencing your pain and growing as well. Yeah. So that's like, and maybe that's heretical. I don't this is a safe space to process ideas about God. Something that, kind of to jump in a little bit, when you talk about people's actual experience of God, and if you were to just ask them, hey, let go of the BS, like stop trying to answer the Sunday school question, and just talk about your experience of God. And people have had that, right? That's I think one thing that keeps me in faith communities is there's too many stories of people saying something happened and I was so transformed by it that I can't explain it. Yeah. And the only language I have for it is God and love and beauty and sacred things. It gives more teeth, not to demonize sort of certain aspects of maybe a more traditional understanding of Christianity, but it gives more teeth to some of those things that are redeemable of it. Yeah. Like the language of God wants a relationship with us. Okay. Yeah. Sure. It gives more teeth to that. I'll be honest, I kind of got like, like, I'm not going to lie. I was just like,
I know. But like what I'm trying to say though is like, God actually, and not only does God want this relationship, whatever, like God is in relationship. Yeah. With everything. Yeah. In some really cool way. Right. it gives more teeth to Jesus's whole thing of sort of narrowing down the rules of how to live life, being about two things, like loving God and loving your neighbor.
Yeah.
Love is something you experience in relationship, right? Like you don't an experience of love has to happen in relationship to something else because you love that thing. You don't, I mean, I guess there's self-love, but that's like,
even that
your own
implies
relationship with yourself, right? Yeah, with your body or with with your story or whatever. So it just gives more teeth to some of those things and allows you to say, yeah, that is the thing. Yeah. Okay, so the fact that God, in the story of Christianity, we talk about God becoming incarnate in Jesus. There's a reason for that because God wants that relationship so deeply and cares so much about humanity or whatever. Right. And then the fact that Jesus was like, nope, these are the two things that matter.
Yeah.
And everything else will come if you like love God and love your neighbor.
Yeah.
As in if you're in relationship and, trying to live in such a way where love is the greatest attribute of those relationships.
Right.
That, I think it just kind of, it almost doubles down on some of those things.
I think so.
Even though, you cringed at like the personal relationship with God.
Yes,
is that the thing? It's like
I don't know,
where
man.
people are like, oh yeah, like you want a personal.
I went down this. I followed so many altar calls to have a personal relationship with Jesus, and I'm just like, but no, I think you're right. Like 'cause that's one thing. Like even now I think about like what does it mean to love God? Like I don't have a hard time with that. Like 'cause I don't know what that means. Like I used to growing up, I was like, yeah, I love God. I would go to worship and I would sing songs and I would fucking feel it, man. Yeah. Like I was like, yeah. And as an adult, like, since I've deconstructed, I'm like, I go to churches and like there'll be like worship songs and I'm like, I don't know what this. I don't feel anything. I'm like, I don't know if there's anybody listening. I don't know what any of this means. And I can like really get lost in the sauce about it. But like when I'm with people I love, right? When I'm with like my family around the holidays, when I'm with friends, having a beer, when I find myself, like with people I love and care about, when I'm with my wife, when I'm like outside and I find myself like really dialed into the present moment and being connected, like open to like what's happening. When I'm able to settle into those, and that's when I find God, right? So like, I'm like, so when we talk about like loving God and loving our neighbor, I think like even like recognizing that like in these present relationships that I find myself in, family, my partner, the world, like, and even within my own relationships I have with my own body, like realizing like, in those relationships there is the divine, there is something, there's God is there. And that to me is what process really allowed me to do. So I really took this relationship that went like between me and God, some sort of like vertical connection, and it transformed it into a relationship that like, if I'm fully aware to it, is between me and now like everything, like, and that's like, like the whole thing is somehow sacred now.
And to kind of to share like the why behind this podcast. There's kind of this connection to that. Is if my relationship with God or being in relationship with God, whatever language we want to use, isn't sort of relegated to these certain words or the Bible or being in a church building, if whatever we call the sacred can happen wherever, right now, like God is present with us in this relationship. Another thing, just side note, when people say when 2 or 3 are gathered, when 2 or 3 are gathered, there's connection and relationship. Like, so it gives more teeth to that one.
Yeah. Because like, who hasn't been in a good meal, like with good friends, and you like walk away, like you're on a double date, and you walk away and you look at your wife and you're like, God, that was fucking awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, oh, my bucket is filled. Like God is in that moment, right?
And,
God
and
is
that connection, and that the conversations, and, what we learned about each other, and all that stuff, and the food that we ate. Like God can be experienced in eating really good food in my relationship to. So, but what I was going to say is, when you don't have those boxes, and when you don't narrow God down to like the Bible and church, and using churchy language, or having worship songs that have churchy language, it opens you up to seeing God or experiencing God, relating to God, the invitation towards the flourishing in all kinds of things. So you can watch an amazing movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once and be moved by it. And at the end of it, you're in tears and you're like, oh my gosh, that's an invitation right there. Like I'm experiencing something so beautiful. Or you can hear a song by someone that is not explicitly Christian and be moved by their song because it touches on, some deep seated struggles of being a human or some beautiful things about life and whatever. Or you can, sit outside in your yard and watch your dog run around and just seeing the joy that your dog has. And you're like, oh, there's something about God in this experience. Like God and the joy that my dog is experiencing and that I'm experiencing in relationship to my dog. And then you get up and go run around and play. Like play. God can be in play. It opens you up to sort of quote unquote, where is God on a much deeper level. Yeah. And it expands it a little bit. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. And I think that is like I said earlier, like that's the invitation.
Yeah.
Available in every present moment. So I'm reading a book right now, and we'll talk about this more in like ethics or whatever, but I'm reading this book right now called Desert.
Yeah.
And it's about how do we and the book is like this idea that like we are currently losing the climate crisis, right? Like it's looking real bad. And the book is written from an anarchist perspective, and the guy is like the global anarchist revolution. It's not going to happen. Like it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. And we need to give up on it. But what we can be open to is like moments of like he calls it. It comes back. The term he comes out is wild and wilderness and liberty. Right? These moments of like we can have our own little pocket of something here.
Yeah.
We can find it here. And like maybe they're not everywhere. They're not like popped up, but like at the peripheries is where we can find them.
Kind of like the Maroons.
Yeah, like the Maroons, like little pockets of resistance and creativity and flourishing, and process is process. That's to me. That's what process means. Is like it is like you are in a context. You have a moment. Yeah. You have resources available to you. You have like the wisdom of your ancestors. You have the whole world in your phone. Like you have a whole bunch of things that at your disposal. And even though like sometimes like things are bleak right now, we can do some stuff.
Yeah.
Like and maybe that's enough. Right.
Yeah.
Like, and that to me is like a process. Like when process talks about eschatology and like, what's the future look like? It's like, we just have these things at our disposal and you do them. And, we do them because we're stepping into that like vitality and
Yeah. It's almost like the invitation is both sort of a social invitation to us as communities to create our society in such a way that leads to the flourishing of everybody, and also personally and within our like close knit circles to say, okay, maybe we just create pockets of resistance where it like another way that I can think about it is, ending the cycle of trauma. Yeah. So, at some point you have to end the cycle, right?
Right.
When you become aware of it yourself, you're like, oh my gosh, this cycle of trauma has existed for generations in my family. And I can't fix that. I could be angry at it,
sure,
and resentful that I grew up in this family and that all these things happen, and be angry at God, be angry at society, or I could say, you know what, I'm gonna spend the money that I have because therapy is freaking expensive, and I'm gonna work on that trauma, because I'm gonna choose to do my best to not pass that on to the next generation, and so I think what's so beautiful about process theology for me is it opens up where we experience God and God's relationship to us. Because God is not a demanding God that has these rigid laws that are arbitrary and have nothing to do about how we relate to each other. And rather, God cares deeply about the flourishing of everybody and is offering that invitation in every moment. I think it allows us to experience God on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah. It's rad. It's good times.
Yeah. That was awesome.
That was cool. We went places. Like, I didn't plan on going to those places, and then we went there, and I was like, All right. So I imagine we could probably do this for a few more times. I know there's one more thing I want to talk about.
Yeah.
Like going forward, I want to talk about ethics. Like, what does this mean? How this has personally affected my personal ethics. And I think it'd be really fun to do a Q&A episode.
Yeah.
So I know my dad listens. He's one of our listeners of the dozens. He asked me a question and I was like, cool, write those down and get those. So I think people who are listening.
Yeah. So follow us on Instagram because we'll probably do it through there.
Yeah. And then just hit us up on Instagram, hit us on the DMs and we will take those questions.
Yeah.
And we'll answer them.
That.
I think it'd be really dope.
I think that'd be cool. That's awesome.
And we'll answer them and we'll probably maybe not do a good job of it, but we'll try. I think
it'll be great. Yeah. We'll collect some questions. Okay, cool. I love that. We could do like a little bowl and just like pull.
That'd be rad. We get a bowl.
Yeah.
We
just
need a
like
bowl.
okay, your turn.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I love it.
Awesome. Okay. Hype zone, man.
Hype zone. Yeah. Okay. I think it's going to be similar for us.
Okay.
Have a feeling.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Lay it on me.
Yeah. We played an awesome game this Saturday.
Yes.
It was so cool.
Yes.
Let's give them a little explain.
Okay. So the game we played War of the Ring.
Yeah. It's a Lord of the Rings themed game.
So it's Lord of the Rings, and it basically it looks like Risk from above, right? It's like classic, like a big board, it's a map, lots of like plastic dudes on the map, and you're gonna be pushing those guys around, taking over armies, fighting, and so that it's Lord of the Rings based. So it starts you off. The Fellowship is in Rivendell. You have the free peoples like the dwarves, the elves, the Rohan, Gondor, the Dunedain, the North, right? They're all like kind of like not ready to go to war because they're like, I don't know if Sauron's back. The elves are like, yeah, he's back. We're not ready to fight yet. Then have the shadow players. So that's like Isengard and Sauron and all of his minions and all his people. And they're like, they're ready to go. And the game basically becomes this race between the good guy who's like, I need to get the ring to Middle Earth or like to Mordor. And then the bad guy who's like, I'm like the military superpower. I'm just going to steamroll everyone with my boxes and boxes of armies, right?
Yeah, army of orcs.
Armies of orcs, right?
Goblins,
and because that's the thing, like, right? Like my guys, like, because I played the bad guy, right? My guys, when they die, like, they just could come back. But like when I killed an elf, when I killed a dwarf, they're dead forever, right? And so like, that had to like I was like watching you this like small like quick like pile and I was like got him, but like the game like it's one of the more complex games out there. Like I've looked up on like so Board Game Geek, they have like they rate games by complexity with like 5 being like the hardest. This game's like a 4.5, 4.2, 4.2.
Yeah, it's a doozy. It is for strategy nerds.
It is
like people that are this is quite the opposite of Candyland here.
Yes, we are in the deep end. It took me like
Nerd.
so I got there early to one because like I know it's busy and I want to like because we need a big hunking table, so I had to like lock us down a table, and then it took me like a good 45 minutes just to set up the pieces.
Oh dang!
And then like
I didn't know you did this, but
like it takes a long time because like all those pieces have to go in particular places, right? And there's like you have like there's a map and you got to read in your chat constantly checking back and forth between the map, and then like the teach probably was another 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we started playing around 3. We wrapped up around like 7:45, almost 8, and God, it was so good.
It was cool.
It was so
good. And the cool thing about it is, and I think this is like where, video games or board games can do a really good job.
Yeah.
Is if you fell in love with whether it's books or movies of a particular world, whether it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, a game that immerses you in it and you experience what it's like to be and the thing that originally connected you to this series and this world is really cool. And so the game, it almost, you feel like you're a part of what's happening in the movies and you're getting to make choices, and some of them might relate to events that happen in the movie, or sometimes you might do something completely different. But it's all the possibilities of the way that it could have gone. Obviously, within the books and the movies, it went one direction. It was, a series of events, but it's kind of like the possibilities are at your disposal about how to get the task accomplished. And that's really cool. So like instead of having to travel the exact path that, Frodo and Sam and Gollum traveled to get to Mordor, you could go on a different path.
Yeah.
Or, instead of doing that, you could win through battle. And so
Right.
it was really cool. Yeah.
it's
kind of like when I played Knights of the Old Republic, if you've ever played that game.
Yeah.
That was one of the best Star Wars games because you felt like you were actually a Jedi, or you could make choices that led you down the path to the to the dark side. And so like you felt like your choices actually mattered because your character, and I think in the second one, if I remember right, you visibly started to change. So like you would notice, like if you're going down the path of the dark side, like you'd have darker bags under your eyes and like all this stuff. And so it's like, oh, I'm actually in the story.
Yeah.
I'm getting to live it out. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
Oh man.
So that's fun.
God, it was so good. It was, oh man. It's one of those games where it's like, it's such a commitment, like, but that's kind of like what makes it great is it's like, oh, this isn't something that like, I don't think we're going to play this again for like many months, probably just because it's like, it's a pain in the butt to get to the table, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
it takes,
exactly.
Like, we're like, well, we got to make sure we have a full Saturday off.
Yeah.
Like, but like when you do and you're like, get ready. Cause we're going to like do this.
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't imagine this being like, it's just, it's sweet,
it's awesome.
It's special.
It's super fun.
It's an event.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Highly recommend. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was, man, this process has, party, series has been fun. Hopefully it's been interesting for you guys.
Yes.
We'll have a Q&A in a couple episodes. So you might start thinking about your questions. If
Shoot us our questions.
You're like, what the hell are we talking about here?
Yep.
Drop them in.
Please do. Please do.
Yeah,
Awesome.
we'll take them all. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.